One of the greatest forces of liberation that you can do is to unbind time. Time is a powerful mystery. In the modern world, we tend to think of time as a kind of mechanical device, like scientific, almost military, as if time really fits the clock and the calendar. And the clock and the calendar are man made. They're not intrinsic, they're not built into the organic living universe. So, this idea that time begins in the past and moves to the present and on to the future in a linear form, like an arrow or a military marching band, there are 60 seconds in a minute, there are 60 minutes in an hour, there are 24 hours in a day, there are 365 days in a year, 100 years in a century. Time didn't always work that way. This is a relatively recent invention in the history of humanity. The Hungarian philosopher Jean Gebser said that the modern concept of time took as long as the pyramids did to be built. We've come to this very narrow concept of time that almost nobody thinks of as a concept. They just think of that's the way it is. We're trained to be that's the way it is. It produces a lot of fear. It actually turns out to be a tyrant, like a pharaoh, lording over us, in which people freak out if they're getting older, if they're not able to conform to what the clock demands. But this is not the only way that time works. There are other time streams besides the modern concept of the arrow that begins in the past, goes on to the present, and then on to the future. That's linear time. And then there's what I call reverse linear time. There's a time that begins in the future and moves into the present and then goes on to the past. I've run into this reverse linear time because there's been a couple of points in my life where I dreamed something years and years before it happened, and I caught up to it. Now, how could it be that I dreamed very specific events and places years before those things actually happened in my life, and then caught up with them? The only way that could be is if there's a future that already exists, rather than the sense of a future as something you have to wait for until it happens. This concept becomes more fleshed out when you apply it to past lives, because many people at this time on earth have come to realize the truth of having past lives. But few people have come to realize the truth of having future lives. But you see, you can't have one without the other. Because if you have past lives, then you yourself are the future life of those people that you used to be. And so if you're the future self of your own past selves, then you've got to have future selves that you're the past life of. And you can work with this principle, because if what I'm saying is correct, and this idea of time as an arrow that only moves from past, present to future is incorrect, and that another way that time moves is the reverse, from future to present to past, that means that things you do now can have an effect on who you used to be at earlier moments in this life as well as in past lives. You can have a revelation now that you can send back to the you that you used to be at an earlier point in this life. You can comfort periods in this lifetime where you were distraught, where you were at wit's end, having a really hard time, in a state of anguish. And you can send your energy back to them and say, guess what? You're gonna get through that. The reason I know is because I am. Because I exist, you made it through that. You can extend that reverse linear communication to your past lives as well as to your past selves in the current life. This is a reverse linear time. There's another time stream that I call rock in the lake time because it's not linear. Unlike the first two time streams I was talking about, this is the one, like when you throw a rock in a lake, the ripples spread in 365 degrees. And this is the kind of nonlinear time where a certain event can be so powerful, it becomes multidimensional, and it instantly spreads through past future. It spreads everywhere, all around. Like meeting a certain person, and it's not just that two people meet, it's also that the pasts and futures of those two people intersected in this multidimensional engagement you might not be able to consciously track with all the various ripples that move from that singular event, but you can feel it, you can sense it, and sometimes you can catch up to it. I have had experiences in my teens, and probably in my 20s and 30s too, not a lot of them, but a few experiences where I met a future self of mine who gave me something, maybe just their presence. Sometimes they may have communicated something to me, got something through to me, usually telepathically, not so much in words. And then I've had the additional experience of catching up to that future self. In other words, when I was 17 years old, smoking hash in a tree in a forest in Stratford, Connecticut with my friend, my future self came in and delivered a kind of a presence to the event. Years later, when I reached the age that future self was at, I remembered the same experience from the opposite end of the time stream. I realized, oh, this is who I was when I sent myself back to my 17-year-old self. When you unbind time, you loosen that tyrannical stranglehold, kind of like the way jazz music did in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Marching band music had been prevalent prior to jazz, and marching band music divided up time very rigidly and mechanically, like da-dum, 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 da-dum. And jazz came along and in that exact same amount of time broke time up, syncopated it, like dum 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 dum. And just the way that jazz liberated time from the John Philip Sousa marching band military version of it, so too can unbinding time create a kind of jazz, an art of your life, a life art, where you get to improvise and move in much freer ways, even in the same amount of space, in the same amount of space time. Like when you're driving cross country and you might decide, I'm going to reduce the amount of time this trip is going to take. It's not going to take anywhere near as long. I've done this several times driving cross country and on long road trips, where instead of being daunted by the hours and hours and thousands of miles, I just shrink time. I just decide it's not going to take that long. And before I know it, I'm already coming out the other side of it. So the way that you unbind time and learn how to work with it can be one of the most liberating things you could ever do.